I walked into my parents' 35th anniversary dinner exactly 10 minutes before the time written on the invitation. Or at least, that was what I believed. The dining room smelled of fresh coffee and melted butter instead of dinner. Every plate on our long family table had already been cleared away. Half-empty wine glasses caught the warm light hanging from the ceiling. Dessert forks rested on folded napkins. Someone had already scraped the last bite of cake from the serving tray. For a second, I wondered if I had walked into the wrong private room. Then my mother looked up. "There you are," she said with a smile so casual it almost convinced me nothing was wrong. "You're late." Late. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. My sister laughed into her champagne glass. "I can't believe she still managed to be late," she said. "Some things never change." A few cousins chuckled with her. I stood there holding the small gift bag I had picked out for my parents. It suddenly felt childish in my hand. "I thought dinner started at 7, I said quietly. "It did," my brother answered before anyone else could speak. 7 sharp. "We waited a little while, but you didn't show." He shrugged dramatically. "We couldn't keep everyone hungry forever." The room filled with polite laughter. I looked around the table. Nobody seemed surprised that I had missed the entire celebration. Not one person had called. Not one text message asked where I was. Not even my parents seemed disappointed that their oldest daughter hadn't been there for their anniversary toast. That should have hurt more than it did. Maybe because, deep down, I already knew exactly what kind of evening this was going to become. What I didn't know was that it would be the last time my family ever underestimated me. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was still trying to understand why something felt rehearsed. My mother reached for a leather folder resting beside her dessert plate. Without opening it, she slid it across the table until it stopped directly in front of me. "There you go," she said. I looked down at it. "The bill." She smiled again. "Would you take care of it?" The sentence was spoken so naturally that anyone listening would have assumed this happened every time. The uncomfortable part was, it almost did. Around the table, nobody questioned it. Nobody offered to split it. Nobody even pretended to reach for a wallet. My brother leaned back in his chair. "You're always so much better at handling these things." My sister nodded. "Besides, you're the responsible one." Responsible. That had been my family's favorite word for me for almost 20 years. Responsible enough to solve problems. Responsible enough to pay unexpected expenses. Responsible enough to rescue everyone without asking for anything back. Responsible enough to be forgotten until money was involved. I rested one hand lightly on the unopened bill. "I wasn't here for dinner," I said. Mother gave me an almost amused look. "But you're here now." Another wave of laughter rolled around the table. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was worse. It was comfortable. Comfortable because everyone assumed I would do exactly what I had always done. Pay. Smile. Go home. The conversation moved on as if the matter had already been settled. Someone started talking about an upcoming vacation. Someone else complained about property taxes. My father stayed strangely quiet, staring into his coffee cup instead of looking at me. That caught my attention. He usually joined the teasing. Tonight, he looked tired. I noticed little things then. The expensive watch he always wore was missing. His suit looked older than usual. There was a stiffness in his shoulders I didn't remember seeing before. At the time, I didn't know what those details meant. Later, they would explain almost everything. A waiter approached our table carrying fresh coffee. The moment he saw me, he hesitated. Only for a second. His eyes widened ever so slightly before he quickly looked away. He poured my parents' coffee first. Then mine. His hands trembled just enough for me to notice. When he finished, he quietly whispered something to another server passing behind him. The second server glanced toward me, then disappeared into the hallway leading toward the manager's office. That was odd. Very odd. I had been inside this restaurant many times before. The staff usually greeted me differently. Tonight, they seemed uncertain, as if they had been given instructions they weren't sure how to follow. Across the room, I noticed the restaurant manager standing near the reception desk. The moment our eyes met, his expression changed. Recognition. Concern. Then hesitation. He didn't walk over immediately. Instead, he spoke quietly into a small radio clipped to his jacket. My brother noticed none of it. He was too busy waving the leather folder toward me. "Come on," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Don't make this awkward." I looked down at the folder again. I still didn't open it. Not because I was worried about the amount. The total wasn't the part that mattered anymore. Something much larger had already begun unfolding. The strange looks from the staff. The manager refusing to approach. The silence from my father. The invitation that now seemed suspicious. None of it fit together yet. But it would. I remember thinking that if I spoke too soon, I'd ruin something I couldn't quite see. So I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's simply waiting for the truth to arrive on its own. I lifted my eyes from the unopened bill and looked directly across the dining room. The manager had finally made his decision. He straightened his jacket and started walking toward our table. Looking back now, I realized nobody ever asked whether I was tired as long as the lights stayed on. That was my place in the family. Not the favorite. Not the difficult one. Not the successful one. I was simply the dependable one. It sounds like a compliment when you hear it the first few times. Eventually, though, you understand what it really means. It means people stop noticing what you give because they begin expecting it. I learned that lesson much earlier than I should have. When I was 15, my father lost his job for several months. Those were difficult days. My parents argued behind closed doors, pretending my brother, sister, and I couldn't hear them. We heard everything. I started taking small jobs after school. Tutoring. Babysitting. Working weekends at a neighborhood bakery. The money wasn't much, but I handed nearly all of it to my mother. The first time I paid the electric bill, she hugged me. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she whispered. I held on to those words for years. I thought they meant I was loved. What I didn't understand was that appreciation can slowly become expectation. By the time I finished college, nobody thanked me anymore. If the water heater broke, I paid for it. If my brother needed help catching up on rent, I transferred the money. If my sister wanted help with a car payment because she had a rough month, somehow I always found a way. Birthdays. Medical bills. School expenses for nieces and nephews. Unexpected repairs. Every family emergency somehow ended with my phone ringing. And almost every call started the same way. I hate to ask. The strange thing was that I never felt forced. At least not in the beginning. I believed helping people was simply what family did. The problem wasn't generosity. The problem was that generosity only traveled in one direction. Nobody asked whether I had plans for that money. Nobody wondered if I had dreams I wanted to chase. I quietly learned to put my own life on hold because solving everyone else's problems made me feel needed. Need, I would later discover, is not the same thing as love. Then I met Daniel. He wasn't impressed by how much I sacrificed. In fact, it worried him. On our third date, I apologized for answering 3 family phone calls during dinner. He smiled kindly. "You spend a lot of time taking care of everyone else." "I don't mind," I answered. He stirred his coffee before looking back at me. "I know." There was no judgment in his voice. "Just promise me you won't forget that you're someone worth taking care of, too." I laughed it off. At the time, I thought he simply didn't understand my family. Years later, I realized he understood them much better than I did. After we married, we didn't have much. Our first apartment had thin walls and a tiny kitchen where only one person could stand comfortably. The dining table doubled as my office. The couch had been bought secondhand. Every dollar mattered. While other couples spent weekends shopping, Daniel and I spent ours learning. We read books about business. We watched free classes online. We worked long evenings after our regular jobs, building something neither of us was certain would succeed. Some nights we celebrated with takeout. Other nights dinner was peanut butter sandwiches because every extra dollar went back into the business. We never complained. We were building a future instead of buying the appearance of one. Growth didn't happen overnight. It happened one careful decision at a time. One satisfied customer. One recommendation. One long workday followed by another. There were months when I thought we might fail. There were mornings when I woke up before sunrise because I couldn't stop thinking about payroll, suppliers, or invoices. Daniel always reminded me to focus on the next step instead of the entire staircase. Slowly, very slowly, our small company became profitable, then stable, then successful enough that we could hire people instead of doing everything ourselves. Even after the business began thriving, almost nobody in my family knew. That wasn't because I was hiding. It was because they never asked. Whenever we met, conversations revolved around their lives, their vacations, their renovations, their latest purchases. If someone finally turned to me and asked how work was going, the question usually lasted less than 10 seconds before someone interrupted with another story. After a while, I stopped volunteering information. Daniel once asked me if it bothered me. I thought about it for a long time before answering. A little. He nodded. You know why they don't ask? I shrugged. They've already decided who you are. That sentence stayed with me. People often stop seeing you once they've created a version of you that benefits them. To my family, I wasn't a business owner. I wasn't someone building a life. I wasn't a woman with goals, responsibilities, or accomplishments. I was simply the person who always fixed things. As our success grew, Daniel suggested buying a larger house. Instead, we chose something quieter. We paid off our debts. We invested carefully. We built savings. We lived comfortably, but not loudly. Luxury never interested either of us. Peace did. Privacy did. There was another reason we stayed quiet. Money changes conversations. The moment people think you have more than they do, every request suddenly sounds reasonable. Every favor becomes urgent. Every problem somehow belongs to you. Neither of us wanted our relationships measured by our bank account. So we kept our success between ourselves and the people who genuinely needed to know. It wasn't secrecy. It was protection. Looking back, that decision probably saved our marriage. Maybe even my sanity. Still, old habits are difficult to break. Whenever my parents called with another emergency, I usually helped. Not because they demanded it. Because I convinced myself that saying no would make me a bad daughter. Daniel never argued. He simply asked one question after every rescue. Did this actually solve the problem? The answer was almost always the same. No. The emergency disappeared. The pattern remained. I couldn't see it then. I thought loyalty meant carrying whatever my family placed on my shoulders. I didn't realize loyalty without boundaries slowly becomes permission. Years passed that way. Quiet work. Quiet success. Quiet sacrifices. Then, one afternoon, my mother called with unusual excitement. We're planning a big anniversary dinner, she said. Everyone will be there. I smiled. That sounds nice. It won't be the same without you. Those words warmed something inside me. Maybe this dinner would be different. Maybe we would simply celebrate as a family. Maybe, for once, nobody would need anything from me except my company. A few days later, the invitation arrived. Elegant. Gold lettering. A beautiful restaurant. One starting time. Simple enough. I placed it on the kitchen counter without giving it another thought. If only I had looked at it one more time. Because hidden inside that single line, the time printed so neatly on the invitation, was the first move in a plan I hadn't even imagined. One person inside that restaurant recognized me the moment I walked through the door. It wasn't my parents. It wasn't my brother or sister. It wasn't any of the relatives laughing around the table. It was the restaurant manager. I had seen the look on his face from across the dining room before he quickly looked away. At the time, my family thought he was simply watching another customer. They had no idea why he suddenly looked so uncomfortable. Looking back now, I almost felt sorry for him. He had been placed in an impossible position. On one side sat a family demanding that I pay a bill they believed belonged to me. On the other side sat the person who actually owned the restaurant. And because of the way we had always handled things, he couldn't simply announce the truth. Not yet. I kept my hand resting on the unopened leather folder while conversations continued around me as though I had already agreed to pay. My brother was telling one of my cousins about a vacation he wanted to book. My sister was scrolling through photos on her phone. My mother was explaining how difficult it had been to organize such a large anniversary dinner. Listening to them, no one would have guessed I had missed the entire celebration because I had been given the wrong time. Not one person apologized. Not one person even mentioned it again. It was as if my absence had been part of the plan from the beginning. The manager finally started walking toward our table. Each step seemed careful, measured. He wasn't nervous because of me. He was nervous because of everyone else. Halfway across the room, another employee quietly approached him and whispered something. He nodded once, then continued toward us. When he reached the table, he smiled politely. "Good evening, everyone." My mother answered before anyone else could. "Perfect timing," she said, tapping the leather folder. "We're just finishing up." The manager gave a small nod. "I see." His eyes briefly met mine. There was a question in them. "Do you want me to say something?" I gave the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet." He understood immediately. "If there's anything you need," he said carefully, "please let us know." Then he stepped away. My brother laughed. Finally, someone around here understands customer service. The manager didn't respond. He simply walked back toward the front of the restaurant. My family never noticed how respectful his tone had been toward me. They never noticed that he had spoken more cautiously after looking into my eyes. Those small details mattered. Just not to anyone at that table. Watching him disappear toward the reception area reminded me of the first time we met years earlier. Back then, this restaurant had looked very different. The dining room had been nearly empty. Several tables needed repairs. The staff smiled politely, but worry showed on every face. Daniel and I hadn't come looking for a restaurant to buy. We had come for dinner after a long day of meetings. Sometimes opportunities arrive dressed like ordinary evenings. Our server accidentally apologized 3 times for things that weren't his fault. The soup took longer than expected. A coffee machine had broken earlier that day. The manager himself walked over to apologize. He looked exhausted. During our conversation, he quietly admitted they were struggling. Rising costs. Fewer customers. Debt that kept growing. The owners were preparing to sell because they couldn't keep the business alive much longer. Most people would have finished dinner and forgotten the conversation. Daniel didn't. Neither did I. On the drive home, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Daniel smiled. "I know that look." "What look?" "The one that says you're already solving a problem." I laughed. Am I that predictable? Only to me. Over the next few months, we studied everything. Financial records, customer reviews, neighborhood growth, building repairs, employee retention. We weren't interested in buying a famous restaurant. We were interested in preserving something worth saving. There was one condition I insisted on before signing anything. Every employee who wanted to stay would keep their job. No layoffs. No sudden changes. People had already worried enough. The former owners agreed. The manager almost cried when we told him. He had spent years worrying that one day he would have to tell loyal employees they no longer had work. Instead, he got to tell them they could stay. That moment mattered more to me than owning another business ever could. From the beginning, Daniel and I agreed on something else. Our names would stay out of daily operations. Professional managers would run the restaurant. The staff would know who we were. Customers didn't need to. We never wanted people choosing the restaurant because of our names. We wanted them choosing it because they loved the food and the people serving it. That simple decision created a quiet life neither of us regretted. Until that anniversary dinner. Because suddenly, our privacy had collided with my family's assumptions. Back at the table, my sister leaned toward me. "So," she said with a teasing smile, "are you going to pay, or should we all start washing dishes?" Everyone laughed again. I smiled politely. "I haven't decided yet." She blinked. "You've never had to think about it before." "No," I answered softly. "I haven't." The room grew quiet for just a second. Only a second. Then my brother jumped back into the conversation. "Oh, come on. Don't make this into some big principle." "I'm not." "Then open the folder." I looked at it again. Still unopened. The amount inside meant nothing to me. Money wasn't the issue anymore. Truth was. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves while waiting than while arguing. So I waited. Across the room, the manager hadn't returned to his office. Instead, he stood near the reception desk speaking quietly with another employee. A few moments later, he picked up the phone. His voice was calm, professional. He listened more than he spoke. When he hung up, he looked toward me again. This time, there was no question in his expression. Only understanding. Something had been set in motion. Daniel noticed it too. Without looking away from the table, he reached under it and gently squeezed my hand. That was all. No speech. No advice. Just a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. Years earlier, I probably would have opened the folder immediately just to end the awkwardness. Not anymore. Daniel had taught me something that changed my life. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is where the strongest decisions begin. My mother crossed her arms. "Well?" she asked. I met her eyes. "Is that really what you want?" She frowned slightly, as though the question itself confused her. "Of course." Before I could answer, my brother suddenly pushed his chair back with enough force that it scraped loudly across the floor. He looked toward the front of the restaurant and raised his voice. "Manager," he called. "Could you come back over here? I think we need some help convincing my sister to do the right thing." Several nearby tables turned to look. The quiet dinner had just become a public performance. And my brother had unknowingly invited the one person into the conversation who knew exactly who I really was. Some people know when they've won. My family never did. Looking back now, I think that was the biggest difference between us. If they believed they had the upper hand, they couldn't simply enjoy it. They had to make sure everyone else saw it too. That night was no different. The moment my brother called for the manager loud enough for half the dining room to hear, I knew the evening had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Several nearby conversations stopped. People turned in their chairs. A woman at the next table lowered her fork. Even the pianist near the entrance seemed to play a little more quietly. My brother smiled as if he were hosting the room. "There we go," he said, looking around. "Now maybe we can settle this." I still hadn't opened the leather bill folder. It rested exactly where my mother had pushed it. Untouched. That seemed to bother them more than the money itself. The manager returned, his expression calm and professional. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Before I could speak, my mother answered. "My daughter seems confused about paying the bill." The manager glanced at me. I offered no reply. He understood immediately that I wanted him to remain patient. "I see," he said carefully. My brother folded his arms. "She always pays for family dinners." Usually without making it awkward, my sister added. Their words drifted across the room. People weren't pretending not to listen anymore. They were listening. The manager remained perfectly composed. "I'm sure we'll find a solution," he said. "There already is a solution," my brother replied. "She pays." The manager didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll give you another moment." Then he walked away again. My brother laughed. What a strange manager. No, he wasn't strange. He was buying time. At the time, only Daniel and I understood that. Daniel hadn't said more than a handful of sentences since we arrived. Some people mistake quietness for uncertainty. I never made that mistake with him. Under the table, his hand rested lightly over mine for just a second. No pressure. No signal telling me what to do. Just a reminder that whatever happened next, we would face it together. That small gesture settled me more than any speech could have. Across the table, my sister unlocked her phone. "I should record this," she said with a grin. "You never know what might go viral." A few relatives laughed. She lifted her phone. Not directly at me. Just enough to capture the table. She thought she was recording someone refusing to pay a restaurant bill. She had no idea she was recording something completely different. I almost warned her. Almost. Instead, I stayed silent. Silence had carried me through much harder moments than this one. My mother leaned toward me. "I don't understand why you're behaving like this." "Like what?" "Making a scene." The words almost made me smile. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't argued. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't even opened the bill. Yet somehow I was the one making a scene. Funny how that works. The loudest people often believe the quietest person is creating the problem. My brother leaned back confidently. You know, he said loudly, some people forget where they came from. A cousin nodded. That's true. He continued before anyone else could interrupt. Mom and Dad helped you your whole life. I looked at him. Did he believe that? Or had he repeated the story so many times that it had become true inside his own mind? He kept talking. They sacrificed everything for you. My sister joined in. And now paying for one dinner is suddenly too much? My mother sighed dramatically. We didn't raise you to be selfish. The words hung in the air. Selfish. For years, that single word had been enough to make me reach for my wallet before anyone finished asking. Not anymore. Because over the last few years, Daniel had gently taught me to ask one simple question whenever guilt appeared. Would helping solve the problem, or only postpone it? That question had changed everything. I looked around the table. Nobody asked why I had missed dinner. Nobody wondered why I had been given the wrong time. Nobody apologized. Instead, they were discussing my character. That told me everything I needed to know. Nearby diners were openly watching now. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A young couple near the window whispered to each other. An older gentleman slowly folded his newspaper without taking his eyes off our table. The room had become exactly what my brother wanted. An audience. He stood from his chair. I'll make this simple. He pointed toward the leather folder. Either you pay it. He paused for effect. Or explain to everyone here why you suddenly think you're too good for your own family. The room became so quiet that I could hear glasses clink in the kitchen. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered with the same calm voice I had used all evening. I never said I was too good for anyone. Then prove it. I don't think I need to. His smile faded. He wasn't expecting that answer. He had prepared for excuses. For anger. Maybe even tears. Calmness frustrated him far more. People who want to fight rarely know what to do with peace. Across the dining room, I noticed something else. The manager wasn't standing alone anymore. A well-dressed woman wearing a navy blazer had entered through the main entrance. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm. The manager greeted her immediately. They exchanged only a few quiet words. Then both of them looked toward our table. Daniel followed my eyes. He recognized her before I did. Very quietly, so only I could hear, he said, "She's from regional operations." I gave the slightest nod. That wasn't unusual by itself. Regional leaders visited different locations from time to time. What mattered was the timing. She wasn't here by accident. The manager had made a decision after my brother publicly demanded that I pay. He had followed company procedure. Nothing more. Nothing less. My family noticed the woman looking toward us. My sister frowned. Who's that? No idea, my brother said with a shrug. Probably another manager. If they think we're leaving without paying, they're mistaken, my mother added. I almost corrected her. Not because of the bill. Because of the word we. All evening, they had spoken as though the responsibility belonged to me alone. Now that another authority figure had arrived, suddenly it was we. Fear has a strange way of changing pronouns. The woman spoke briefly with the manager. She opened her portfolio. He pointed toward our table. She looked down at a document for only a second before closing it again. Then she straightened her jacket. Her expression became serious. Professional. Almost ceremonial. Daniel looked at me one more time. You don't have to say anything, he whispered. I know. That was always our agreement. The truth should never need defending. Real truth has a way of introducing itself. The woman began walking toward us. The manager followed one step behind. Neither of them looked at the leather bill folder. Neither of them looked at my brother. Their eyes stayed on me. And for the first time that evening, I realized the biggest moment wasn't approaching because of anything I had done. It was approaching because my family simply couldn't stop digging the hole beneath their own feet. I never introduced myself. Someone else did it for me. That mattered more than I can explain. If I had stood up and announced who I was, my family would have called it a lie. They would have accused me of trying to escape the bill. They would have demanded proof before believing a single word. Instead, the truth walked toward our table wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. The woman stopped beside the manager. She smiled politely at everyone before looking directly at me. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was calm, confident, and practiced. "I apologize for interrupting your family celebration." Nobody answered. The room had become strangely quiet. She extended her hand toward me. "It's good to see you again." I stood and shook her hand. "It's good to see you too." My brother looked from one of us to the other. "You two know each other?" The woman turned to him politely. "Yes." Nothing more. Just one word. Simple. Certain. She looked back at me. "I'm sorry the situation reached this point." "It's all right," I answered quietly. I wanted to be sure before anyone stepped in. She nodded as though that made perfect sense. Because it did. The manager stood respectfully beside her without saying a word. My sister lowered her phone just a little. For the first time that evening, she looked uncertain. My mother forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who are you exactly?" The woman reached into her portfolio. "My name is Evelyn Harper. I oversee regional operations for this group of restaurants." She paused. "And I'm here because the manager contacted me after concerns were raised involving the owner." Silence. Complete silence. My brother frowned. "The owner?" "Yes." He laughed. "Well, that's unnecessary. We're just trying to get my sister to pay the bill." Evelyn looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn since arriving. "I understand." Another short pause. "But your sister is not a guest who is refusing to pay." She turned toward me again. "She is the owner of this restaurant." No one spoke. Not immediately. The words seemed to hang in the air without finding a place to land. My sister blinked twice. My mother stared at Evelyn as if she had misheard her. My brother actually laughed. A loud, awkward laugh. "That's funny." Nobody joined him. He looked around the table, waiting for someone else to laugh. No one did. He looked back at Evelyn. "Seriously. I am serious. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." "It isn't." The manager finally spoke. "There is no misunderstanding." His voice was respectful. Professional. "I can confirm Mrs. Carter and her husband are the owners through Mercer Hospitality Holdings." My family looked at me, then back at him, then back at me again. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to add. The truth had arrived exactly the way it was supposed to. From someone else. My mother shook her head slowly. "No." She smiled nervously. "No, that can't be right." Evelyn opened her portfolio. Inside were several documents. She didn't place them on the table dramatically. She simply looked at them before closing the folder again. "There is no error." My brother crossed his arms. "If she owns this place." He pointed around the dining room. "Then why didn't she say so?" That question almost answered itself. Evelyn looked at him. "Because she didn't need to." Again, silence. Those 6 words carried more weight than any speech I could have given. Daniel smiled quietly beside me. He had known this moment would matter. Not because of the restaurant. Because dignity always carries more power than self-defense. Nearby diners had completely stopped eating. The pianist had quietly finished his song. Servers stood respectfully at a distance. No one pretended not to notice anymore. Whispers spread across the room. "Did she say owner?" "I think she did." "They were trying to make her pay." "I can't believe this." The sound rolled gently through the dining room like a wave. Not loud. Just enough for my family to realize everyone had heard. My sister slowly lowered her phone. She looked at the screen for a moment, then quietly locked it. Whatever she thought she had been recording was no longer the story. My brother looked at me again. "You own this restaurant?" I nodded once. "Yes." That was all. One word. After spending the entire evening saying almost nothing, I wasn't about to start explaining myself now. Questions filled his face faster than he could ask them. "Since when?" "A few years." "You never told us." You never asked." The words came out gently, not as an accusation, simply as the truth. He opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. For years, my family had assumed they knew everything important about my life. Now they were realizing how little they had actually noticed. My mother finally found her voice. You own this place?" "Daniel and I do." She looked toward him. He gave her the same polite smile he always had. No pride. No anger. Just quiet confirmation. My father hadn't spoken since Evelyn arrived. He simply stared at the table. His coffee had gone cold. His hands rested together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. For some reason, seeing him like that hurt more than watching everyone else panic. Because unlike the others, he didn't seem surprised by my success. He seemed ashamed. I didn't understand why. Not yet. Evelyn turned back toward the table. The manager followed company policy by contacting regional leadership before taking further action. She looked toward me. "Would you like us to prepare another table or provide additional privacy?" "No." I glanced around the room. "This is fine." She nodded respectfully. "If you need anything, we're here." With that, she and the manager stepped back. Neither of them mentioned the bill. Neither of them asked for payment. They simply returned to their responsibilities. The message was unmistakable. There had never been a payment dispute. Only a misunderstanding built on assumptions. The whispers continued. A few diners quietly clapped. Not loudly. Just enough to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The applause wasn't for wealth. It wasn't because I owned a restaurant. It was because people recognized unfairness when they saw it. And they had watched that unfairness collapse under its own weight. My brother sat down slowly. For the first time in my life, he didn't seem to know what to say. My sister couldn't look me in the eye. My mother's confident smile had disappeared completely. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. The room that had laughed with them only minutes earlier had grown completely still. Then something happened that surprised me most of all. My father slowly lifted his head. He finally looked directly at me. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. With quiet exhaustion. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Thea." He swallowed hard. "Could we talk somewhere private?" Something inside me shifted. Because I suddenly realized the restaurant had never been the real problem. It had only been the doorway. Whatever my father wanted to say next was far heavier than an unpaid dinner bill. And somehow, I already knew my family's biggest secret hadn't been revealed yet. Owning the restaurant wasn't the biggest secret that night. It was only the one everyone else could see. The real secret had been sitting quietly across from me the entire evening, hidden behind my father's silence. When he asked if we could speak somewhere private, nobody argued. Not even my brother. A few minutes earlier, he had wanted the entire restaurant watching. Now he couldn't seem to look at anyone. Daniel stood beside me as we followed my parents into a small private meeting room near the back of the restaurant. The manager quietly closed the door behind us, giving us complete privacy. The room felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened in the dining room. No audience. No whispers. No laughter. Just 4 chairs, a small wooden table, and years of unspoken truth waiting to find its way into the open. Nobody spoke at first. My father kept staring at his hands. My mother folded and unfolded a paper napkin until it began to tear. Daniel stayed beside me without saying a word. Finally, my father took a slow breath. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words surprised me more than anything that had happened all evening. I couldn't remember the last time I had heard him apologize to me. He looked older than he had only an hour before. Not because of his age. Because of the weight he had been carrying. "I should have stopped this long ago," he said quietly. My mother closed her eyes. "We never wanted tonight to happen like this." I looked at her calmly. "Then why did it?" Neither of them answered immediately. My father finally spoke again. "Because we ran out of options." The sentence settled heavily between us. I waited. Years earlier, I would have rushed to fill the silence. I would have asked what was wrong. I would have started solving problems before I even understood them. Not this time. If they had something to tell me, They needed to say it themselves. My father nodded slowly, almost as if he respected my silence. We're in debt. The words came out quietly. Almost too quietly. My mother looked away. It started small, she admitted. A renovation. A vacation. A few loans. We thought we'd catch up. But we never did. She rubbed her forehead. Then interest kept growing. My father continued. We borrowed against the house. I felt my stomach tighten. We refinanced twice. Another pause. Then we borrowed again. The room became very still. Suddenly the missing watch made sense. The older suit. The tired face. The way he had avoided looking at me during dinner. He hadn't been embarrassed because I owned the restaurant. He had been embarrassed because he knew why they had invited me. My mother quietly wiped her eyes. We thought. She hesitated. We thought after dinner you'd do what you've always done. I finished the sentence for her. Pay. She nodded without lifting her head. No one denied it. No one even tried. For the first time in years, my family had stopped pretending. It hurt. But honesty often hurts before it heals. My father looked directly at me. I knew giving you the wrong time was wrong. I blinked. You knew. He nodded. I argued against it. The room fell silent again. I told them we should just ask you honestly. He looked toward my mother before lowering his eyes again. But I didn't stop it. His voice cracked. And that's on me. I believed him. Not because he was asking for forgiveness. Because for the first time all evening, he wasn't trying to protect his pride. He was telling the truth. My mother spoke again. We've been pretending everything was fine. She gave a sad little laugh. We kept hosting dinners. Buying gifts. Replacing furniture. We cared too much about what people thought. She looked around the small room. And now we can't even afford the life we've been pretending to live. Daniel finally spoke. His voice stayed gentle. How bad is it? My father answered immediately. Worse than they know. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded envelope. He placed it on the table. Inside were overdue notices. Loan statements. Final warnings. Numbers covered nearly every page. Some balances were larger than I expected. Others were heartbreaking. Not because of the amounts. Because I recognized the pattern. None of this had happened overnight. It had taken years. Years of spending. Years of hiding. Years of hoping tomorrow would somehow solve yesterday. My mother quietly whispered, we thought if we could just get through this year. Her voice disappeared. I looked down at the papers again. Every instinct inside me wanted to start calculating solutions. Sell this. Pay that. Refinance here. Negotiate there. That was who I had always been. The fixer. The rescuer. The dependable daughter. For just one brief moment, I almost reached for my phone. I could have transferred enough money before anyone finished another sentence. The problem would disappear. At least for tonight. Then I heard Daniel's voice in my mind. Not from this room. From dozens of conversations over the years. Did solving the emergency solve the problem? The answer had never changed. No. It only delayed the next emergency. I slowly placed the paperwork back onto the table. My mother looked at me hopefully. She had seen that movement before. Usually it meant I had already decided to help. She smiled through her tears. I knew you'd understand. I looked at her gently. I do understand. Relief flooded her face. Too soon. Because I wasn't finished. I understand exactly how this happened. My father watched me carefully. So you'll help us? I took a long breath. The room felt smaller somehow. Not because of the walls. Because of the choice sitting between us. If I rescued them again, nothing would change. Maybe not next month. Maybe not next year. But eventually we would end up in another room having another version of the same conversation. Because money had never been the real problem. The real problem was believing appearances mattered more than honesty. The real problem was expecting someone else to quietly carry the cost. I loved my parents. That hadn't changed. Love wasn't the question. The question was whether love required me to keep feeding the very pattern that had brought us here. For years, I had confused sacrifice with loyalty. Now I understood they weren't always the same thing. Sometimes the most loving answer isn't the easiest one. Sometimes it is the hardest word you have ever spoken. My mother reached across the table. She gently touched my hand. Please. Just one word. The same kind of word that would have broken my heart years earlier. It still hurt. Just differently. I looked at both of my parents. Then at Daniel. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply trusted me to choose. For the first time in nearly 20 years. I chose differently. I met my parents' eyes. My voice stayed calm. Steady. Almost gentle. No. The room became perfectly still. My mother's hand slowly slipped away from mine. Neither of them knew it yet. But that single word wasn't the end of my help. It was the end of the old way they expected to receive it. The hardest word I spoke that night wasn't no. It was what came after it. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. My mother's eyes filled with fresh tears. My father looked down at the table again, as though he had expected this answer all along. Daniel remained beside me, quiet as always. He knew I wasn't finished. My mother finally found her voice. So, that's it? The disappointment in her words wasn't angry. It was wounded. I understood why. For almost 20 years, my answer had always been yes. Sometimes I had said it immediately. Sometimes after pretending to think about it. But eventually, I always rescued everyone. Tonight felt different because it was different. I gently shook my head. No, I said softly. That's not it. Both of my parents looked up. I'm not walking away from you. Hope flickered across my mother's face. I'm refusing to continue the same cycle. Neither of them interrupted. For once, they simply listened. I folded my hands on the table before continuing. If I write one large check tonight, what changes? My father stayed silent. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. No answer came, because there wasn't one. The overdue bills disappear, I continued. The loans disappear. The pressure disappears. I paused. But 6 months from now. I looked gently at both of them. What will be different? The room remained quiet. That silence answered the question better than words ever could. Daniel spoke for the first time since we entered the room. His voice was calm. Problems solved with money usually come back if the habits stay the same. Nobody argued. Because everyone knew he was right. My father slowly nodded. They would. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. That honesty gave me hope. Not certainty. Hope. I turned toward him. If I help, it has to be different this time. He looked up. What do you mean? I reached for the stack of financial papers again. This doesn't stay between us anymore. My mother frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying there are conditions. The word hung in the air. Conditions. My family wasn't used to hearing that from me. For years, my help had come with no questions. No limits. No expectations. Those days were over. I spoke slowly because I wanted every word to matter. First, complete honesty. I looked at both of them. No more hidden loans. No more secret credit cards. No more pretending everything is fine. They listened without speaking. Second, I placed one finger on the papers. I want every account. Every debt. Every payment. If we're going to solve this, we solve all of it. My mother looked uncomfortable. That's very personal. So is asking someone else to rescue it. She lowered her eyes. I hadn't meant the sentence to sound harsh. It simply happened to be true. I continued. Third, I looked toward Daniel. We work with a professional financial counselor. My brother's voice suddenly came from the doorway. A counselor? We all turned. Neither of us had noticed he had quietly entered the room. My sister stood behind him. Both of them looked uncertain. Nobody had the confidence they carried at dinner. Daniel nodded politely. Someone objective. Someone who isn't emotionally involved. My brother frowned. We don't need strangers knowing our business. I looked at him calmly. The business has already become everyone's business. He knew exactly what I meant. Half the restaurant had watched the evening unfold. Privacy had disappeared long before this conversation. I continued before anyone could interrupt. Fourth, I looked around the room. Every adult takes responsibility. Nobody looked happy. But nobody argued. I'm not paying bills so someone else can keep spending. No new luxury purchases. No vacations. No expensive gifts. No pretending. We rebuild honestly. My sister crossed her arms. So everyone gets punished? I shook my head. No. Everyone participates. There is a difference. Punishment looks backward. Responsibility looks forward. She didn't answer. My father slowly rubbed his forehead. I should have done this years ago. His voice carried more regret than self-pity. I kept believing one more loan would fix everything. It never did. I nodded. I know. He looked surprised. You do. I've spent years fixing emergencies. I smiled sadly. They just happened to belong to different people. The room grew quiet again. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. For the first time all evening, nobody was trying to win. My mother looked at me with tired eyes. What if we fail? The question sounded genuine. Not manipulative. Just frightened. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. Then we adjust. We learn. We keep going. But we don't lie anymore. Tears rolled quietly down her face. I don't know how we became these people. Neither did I. Maybe it hadn't happened all at once. Maybe little compromises simply became larger ones until nobody remembered where they had started. Daniel spoke gently. Most financial disasters don't begin with greed. They begin with denial. My father nodded. That's exactly what happened. There was something freeing about hearing him admit it. Truth has a strange way of making even painful situations feel lighter. Not easier. Just clearer. A few minutes later, we returned to the dining room together. Conversations had become quieter. Some relatives pretended not to notice us. Others openly stared. The anniversary dinner had ended long ago. Only awkwardness remained. My brother cleared his throat. So, he looked from me to our parents. What happens now? Before I could answer, my father surprised everyone. We're selling the lake house. The entire table looked at him. My sister's eyes widened. What? We can't afford it. Mother slowly nodded. And we're canceling the vacation. My brother looked stunned. We already paid deposits. We'll lose less canceling now than going later, Father answered. It was the most practical sentence I had heard him speak in years. For the first time, he sounded like someone ready to change instead of someone hoping to be rescued. Not everyone welcomed that change. One of my cousins quietly muttered, "This is ridiculous." Another relative shook his head. If someone has money, family should help. I looked at him calmly. Family should also protect each other from repeating harmful patterns. He didn't answer. Because there wasn't much left to say. Some people understood immediately. Others clearly didn't. That was all right. Change rarely happens at the same speed for everyone. As people slowly gathered their coats, my younger niece walked over to me. She hugged me tightly. I liked what you said. I smiled. What part? When you said telling the truth matters. I hugged her back. It does. She whispered one more sentence before running back to her parents. I hope Grandpa feels better now. I watched her leave. Children often notice healing before adults do. Outside the restaurant, cool evening air replaced the tension inside. Cars pulled away one by one. The parking lot slowly emptied. My parents stood beside their car for a long moment. Before getting inside, my father walked over to me. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make another excuse. He simply hugged me. A quiet, grateful hug. I don't know if we deserve another chance, he said. I hugged him back. That isn't what tonight was about. He stepped away. What was it about? I smiled gently, finally telling the truth. He nodded. Then he and my mother drove away. I watched the taillights disappear into the darkness. For the first time in many years, I wasn't carrying my family's future by myself. They had finally picked up their share of the weight. Even so, I knew the hardest part wasn't behind us. Changing your finances can happen with a budget. Changing your habits can happen with discipline. Changing the way an entire family thinks. That takes much longer. And not everyone was ready to let go of the old story. The restaurant wasn't where my story ended. It was simply where my life finally changed direction. People often imagine that one difficult conversation fixes everything. It doesn't. Real change happens quietly, one honest decision at a time. The months after my parents' anniversary dinner were harder than I expected. Not because of arguments, because of adjustment. For years, my family had lived inside a pattern that felt normal to all of us. I rescued. They depended. Nobody questioned it. Breaking that pattern felt uncomfortable for everyone. Even for me. There were mornings when I woke up wondering if I had been too hard. There were evenings when I almost picked up the phone just to ask if they needed anything. Old habits don't disappear overnight. They slowly lose their grip. A week after the dinner, my parents invited Daniel and me to their house. This time, there was no celebration. No audience. No expensive meal. Just coffee around the kitchen table. The first thing I noticed was the dining room. Several pieces of furniture were gone. My mother smiled when she saw me looking. We sold them. There was sadness in her voice. But there was something else too. Relief. We didn't really need them, she admitted. My father handed me a folder. Not because he wanted me to solve anything. Because he wanted me to see everything. Inside were account statements, loan balances, and a simple handwritten budget. Every debt. Every payment. Every expense. Nothing hidden. For the first time in years, there were no secrets between us. I looked at Daniel. He smiled quietly. This was the beginning we had hoped for. Not a miracle. A process. Over the next several months, my parents met regularly with a financial counselor. The first few meetings were difficult. They had to admit mistakes they had spent years hiding. They learned how much money had quietly disappeared through unnecessary spending. They learned the difference between wanting something and being able to afford it. Most importantly, they learned that asking for help wasn't the same as asking someone else to carry everything. That lesson changed more than their finances. It changed the way they spoke to each other. My father found part-time consulting work after retiring earlier than he should have. He said staying busy helped him feel useful again. My mother started keeping detailed records of every household expense. At first, she joked that she had become the queen of receipts. Eventually, it stopped being a joke. She became proud of every small improvement. Every debt they paid off became a quiet victory. Not because someone rescued them, because they had earned it. My brother had a harder time accepting the changes. For several weeks, he barely spoke to me. He believed I could have solved everything with one check. Technically, he was right. I could have. But solving the numbers wouldn't have solved the thinking. One afternoon, he unexpectedly called. I've been angry, he admitted. I know. I thought you abandoned us. I stayed quiet. Then he sighed. I think I was really angry because you stopped making life easy. I smiled. There's a difference. What? I stopped making unhealthy choices feel comfortable. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he laughed. A small, tired laugh. I hate when you're right. It isn't about being right. I know. Several months later, he asked Daniel for advice about starting a small business of his own. Instead of asking for money, he asked for guidance. That conversation meant more to me than any repayment ever could. My sister changed more slowly. She struggled to let go of appearances. She still cared too much about what everyone else thought. But even she began making different choices. She sold the luxury car she couldn't comfortably afford. She stopped pretending everything was perfect on social media. One day, she quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. I spent years trying to look successful. She smiled sadly. I never realized you were busy becoming successful. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Neither of us needed to say anything else. Sometimes understanding arrives long after the argument ends. As for Daniel and me, life became quieter. Not because we had fewer responsibilities. Because we carried only the ones that truly belonged to us. The restaurant continued to grow. Employees stayed. Customers returned. The manager who had protected my privacy that night remained with the company. At our annual leadership meeting, I thanked him in front of everyone. He looked embarrassed by the attention. I was only doing my job, he said. No, I replied. You were protecting someone's dignity. There is a difference. He understood exactly what I meant. We never spoke about that anniversary dinner again. We didn't need to. Some moments teach their lesson only once. A year later, my parents celebrated another anniversary. This time it was much smaller. Just immediate family. A simple dinner at home. Everyone arrived on time, including me. My mother smiled as she handed me a slice of cake. No bills tonight. We both laughed. It was a small joke, but it carried an entire history inside it. Later that evening, my father pulled me aside. I've been thinking about something. What is it? I used to believe providing for your family meant protecting them from every consequence. He looked around the room where everyone was laughing together. I was wrong. He placed one hand on my shoulder. You taught me that loving someone sometimes means letting them grow. I shook my head gently. We taught each other. Because that was the truth. We had all changed. Some more than others. Some faster than others. But we had changed. When I think back to that night at the restaurant, people often ask me if owning the restaurant was the best part of the story. It wasn't. The restaurant was never the victory. Money wasn't the victory. Watching my family slowly choose honesty over appearances. That was the victory. Seeing my father ask for help instead of hiding. That was the victory. Watching my mother celebrate paying off a debt instead of buying something new. That was the victory. Hearing my brother ask for advice instead of a rescue. That was the victory. Learning that my own worth had never been measured by the size of the checks I wrote. That was the greatest victory of all. For almost 20 years, I believed being dependable was the same as being loved. I couldn't have been more wrong. Real love doesn't keep score. It doesn't quietly demand payment. It doesn't grow stronger when one person carries everyone else's weight. Real love tells the truth. Real love accepts responsibility. Real love respects boundaries. And sometimes, real love begins with one small word that feels impossible to say. No. If you've ever been the person everyone depended on but rarely appreciated, I'd love to hear your story. What boundary changed your life, or what boundary are you still trying to set? Share it in the comments, because someone reading your words might find the courage they need today. And if stories about quiet strength, unexpected justice, and ordinary people finding their worth speak to your heart, make sure you subscribe. There are many more stories waiting, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one.